Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this new webinar by the International Energy Agency. This is still in the framework of our capacity reinforcement program on energy statistics and energy modeling. Today, we are very happy to welcome Mark Owells, who is an academic partner and who has extensive experience on energy modeling, working especially a lot on Africa in many different topics. So the idea is that today Mark will present to you his work and his energy modeling approach, which I think is will be complementary to what you have seen listening to IEA World Energy Outlook modelers, so that you have a broader perspective of different tools, different approaches when it comes to energy modeling. I give you the floor in a second, Mark, just before reminding to all of our participants where we are on the agenda of our online course. So today we will have 2 hours and a half for Mark to present his work, and tomorrow we'll have the same format starting at the same time, so 10 a.m. at this time, and we'll receive also some researcher and teachers partners from University Politecnico di Milano, who also are working extensively on energy modeling in Africa. Housekeeping rules, but Mark, I will let you moderate and animate as you wish. But as you all know, we have the Q&A box, so you can ask your questions directly using this box. You can also raise your hand and react for any urgent clarification. For any further additional questions, as always, please feel free to reach out per email. Without further notice, Mark, I give the floor to you. Maybe if you wanted to give a brief introduction of who you are, on what you've been working on so far. And thank you very much for being with us today and bringing your expertise and your knowledge to the participants from Ethiopia today. Up to you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna, for the very kind introduction and for the opportunity to be here. I'd also like to say, very warm, I guess it's still good morning at the moment. Good morning to everybody in Ethiopia. It's a privilege to be able to connect. Maybe a couple of things. The first is that through various ways, I've been working with folk in Ethiopia for some time, and so it's really nice to be able to continue. My name is Mark Howells. I'm a professor at Loughborough University and at Imperial College in London, and I lead a large effort that involves trying to pull together just the best available data, best available models, and other things with a set of partners that have been doing amazing work, and they include, for example, the IEA, but also others in the World Bank and IRENA and the International Atomic Energy Agency and so on. And there's a large number of us who are practitioners. Actually, it's not so large. It would be good if we were a larger number of practitioners, but there are a number of us that come together and pull together information and other things to see how we can make those best available in a way that they're easy to absorb. So some of the things that I'll be presenting today are the joint products. They're things that have been put together by a number of different organizations. So don't for a second please think that this is all myself and Imperial College or whatever. This is a group effort, and it's the case that we've been working quite hard now to try and set up not just the tools and the modeling approaches, but also information that goes behind that. So you'll see some lectures today that we're preparing that come out of something bigger, a summer school that will be completely available through Honor and so on to yourselves. I used to work at the University of Cape Town. My first job was to put together a national energy plan for Thabo Mbeki, the then president of South Africa. This was not too long after Nelson Mandela was released and the country needed a new energy plan. After that, I went to work for the International Atomic Energy Agency and oversaw a set of capacity building activities throughout a number of countries, but in particular, one important effort throughout Africa. Moved on to work at KTH in Sweden. And in fact, we had some really nice collaboration with folk from the Ministry of, from this ministry. And after Sweden, we set up a number of tools and now moved to the UK. Came here just in time for lockdown. So I've not really seen much of the UK. I've been stuck inside of my office for the last year. But while we've been here, we've been working with a set of universities to, as I say, try and make information, material, tools, and other things just much easier to have access to. And so if you're to use them and so on, it's the case that you can easily train staff and have knowledge management programs put in place relatively well. And we're doing this, as I say, together with Honor and others. So maybe if I can jump into what I want us to go through today, I've got a few presentations that I would like us to go through. And we're going to go through a couple of different models. I'm just going to share my screen very quickly. So I think you have access to these presentations at the moment. And so you're more than welcome to download them and follow along. Most of them have got quite detailed speaker notes at the bottom too. So it's the case that if anything I've said is not clear, you can have a look through them and it gives some information. We're going to start by having a look at something called energy balance. We're going to start by looking at a number of different tools. We have a tool called Energy Balance Studio, and this is a tool that was put together by UN Statistics and the International Atomic Energy Agency to help put energy balance information into one space. It's like a very light, much more simplified version of some of the that IEA does as core business. So it's just a very light version of that. Then we'll go into something called MAED, which is the model for the analysis of energy demand. And there's one that just looks at demand increases over time, and then another one that looks at electricity load profiles. So it's the case that, you know, once we've got a picture of the energy system, we can have a look at how this develops over time. And depending on how your system develops, depending on how demand develops, the load profile will look very different. If you have agricultural development, it'll look different to industrial development, and so on. So we'll have a look at that. Then we'll have a look at two tools together. One is called Osmosis, and the other is called Flex tool. Osmosis is an open source energy systems model that's very powerful, but it starts off as something quite simple, and you can use that to look at the energy sector as a whole. And the Flex tool is something that we use just to make sure that systems are flexible enough. At the moment, it's the case that things like solar energy are becoming extremely cheap, but of course they're only cheap when the sun is shining. And so you have to be able to think about how to fit these into the energy system sensibly. And so Flex tool helps you to think that through and make sure the systems are set up correctly. We'll also look at something called FinPlan, which is a simple tool that helps then take what comes out of your energy models. You might identify in your energy model that you want to build a really big new solar park, or a new hydropower plant, or a new gas-fired power plant. And it's one thing to have these inside of our models, but it's another thing to turn that into something that is kind of ready for investment. So we understand where the financing would come from, how you would need to structure the operation of the power plant, and so on. And again, this is a really simple tool. There are much more complicated tools out there to do that. Then we have another model that I will go through really quickly called Clues. Now, The energy sector is critical. We need energy for everything. But it is the case that the energy sector is interwoven with other sectors. So, for example, in Ethiopia, hydro is really important. So energy immediately is wrapped up with the water system. At the same time, you need water for consumption within major cities and for people, but also for agriculture. Lots of water for agriculture, especially if climate begins to change in a way that you require more irrigation and so on, or you're extending into land that requires irrigation. You're going to be needing some of that water, and you're going to need electricity to pump the water as well. So the system becomes interwoven quickly. And so clues is a tool that we use to help look at that. But we'll start with something called the Global Electrification Platform. And underneath that is a tool called OnSSET. And we'll go through that really quickly. So, well, actually, we'll go through all of these relatively quickly because there's a large number of things here. And what I propose that we do is basically after every 25 minutes, we'll stop and have a 5-minute break and then move on, so as not to for things not to become overwhelming. But without further ado, let's get into the Global Electrification Platform. I think I need to change the way I'm doing my screen sharing. So just please do give me 1 second as I change the settings so that you can see my screen. Sorry, my computer, of all of the mornings in the world that it could have issues, it's deciding to have issues right now. Oh no, can you see?
No, we are still on your Explorer, just seeing the list of PowerPoints.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so hopefully right now you can see a picture that says the Global Electrification Platform. Very good. So this is a tool that has been put together that is important because what it does is it has a look at every village, every town, every city, every settlement inside of the country, and it helps to understand the lowest cost way of getting electricity to people. And if you're often an easy choice, you could just connect close to the grid lines and so on, and it can be relatively inexpensive. But if you're further from the grid, it's the case that you may, it may be that solar power or other options allow you to connect less expensively. And so we put this tool together with the World Bank and others that provides an idea of how you would electrify people by when, if you're electrifying them with the grid or electrifying them with off-grid options, whether they're standalone solar panels on top of houses, mini grids in the region, and we look at the option of solar, wind, or hydro. And I'm not sure if this will zoom in fast enough, but we can have a look at, as I say, any particular set anywhere, and it will give you the optimal mix of what to invest in, where, and when. And then if you have a look at the left-hand side of the screen, it's the case that we can play through different scenarios. Do we see population growth being relatively high? Do we want a high or low target for electrification? Are there issues with how fast we can connect in different ways? So sometimes the grid connections can be quite slow, and then it can be helpful to be able to put in place solar options and so on. Is the solar cost going to be or high? And we can change this are here as well, and then that will that will go on results. Now, one of the things is that this tool is set up in a way, what you see now on the screen is something that's been pre-cooked. We've run a few hundred scenarios to give you the options to look at this. But it's the case that under the hood, there is another, there's a tool, a scenario generator it's called, where you can put in all of the information that you have that you think is better than the information that's here. So perhaps you have better population information, or perhaps you have better information about the way the grid is spread out and connected and so on. And so you can take out all of the bits of information that we have in this thing, and you can rerun it with what's called the scenario generator, and that's programmed in a tool called OnSSET. So we'll have a quick look now at geospatial modeling and so on. Before I jump into that, I just want to ask if there are any questions so far on what I've shared. I see there are no open questions for the moment. Okay, very good. So then I will move on very quickly to the OnSSET presentation. Very good. So you'll see that for a start, if you have a look at the bottom right-hand side of the screen here, this presentation's not just been put together by myself with Imperial College and Loughborough University, but with a number of others as well. It's also the case that we have sets of presentations too, that by the end of the month will become available, and you're more than welcome to download those and look through them. And it's the case, as I said earlier on, that if you have a look at the bottom of the screen, there are speaker notes too. So everything that I've said, in fact, probably better things than what I'm saying, are written down there, so you can catch up in your own time if that's if you find that useful. So why do we need to look at geospatial analysis? Well, it's the case that there are a number of things we need energy for. One is to make sure that we have a low-cost input to economic activity, whether that's transport or motive power in industry or other things for agriculture. The lower the cost, and the more reliable it is, the better that your economy will do. At the same time, in households, clinics, and other things, the supply of electricity allows ICT technology, all kinds of other services, education. It enables education, it enables a lot of things. So getting this right is important in many different sectors. And so it's the case that, and some of the later tools will look at, like, the supply of bulk electricity and bulk energy. But OnSSET and the Global Electrification Platform is very much concerned with making sure we get access to electricity to settlements and households. And we start off by looking particularly at access to improve people's lives directly. So more work that's happening at the moment is then to go on and to try and understand how this access is going to accelerate economic growth. So there are a number of different things that are important when we're considering an electrification plan. Some of them we've mentioned here. It's the case that there are more. The first is that we want to try and keep costs low. Of course, we can electrify everybody quite quickly, but it can cost a huge amount of money if we do it incorrectly. So that's one thing that we've got to bear in mind. Another thing is that technologies and business models and things are changing quite fast. So OnSSET, this tool we put together, is deliberately open source. And so once you've gone through the deep training, it's the case that you can change all of the data and so on that's in there. Other things that are important are just environmental issues. As soon as you have enough electricity, for example, to cook with, you'll see that indoor air pollution drops drastically, and this improves health. And it's been quite surprising to see this actually in Zambia, for example. As soon as people got access to enough electricity, enough reliable electricity to start cooking with, and the right kinds of cooking appliances, there was a big shift. Another thing is that there are often two different things that we want to bear in mind. One is, are we going to be using the electricity to make lots of money and for it to pay for itself? Or is it the case that we're doing stuff for social good? And we do that so that we can improve the well-being of people's lives. And then again, that eventually results in greater economic benefit. A final bit, which is interesting, is just on the geopolitics. It's the case that we finished some work for Afghanistan not so long ago, and something that they wanted to have a look at was to make sure that there were energy systems in place for electrification that could withstand unrest, that have periods of unrest. And so we found that you could use OnSSET in a particular way to help them think through how to do that, so that people, even if there was unrest, people would be in a place to have reliable supplies of secure energy. So a couple of things that are just important. Number one, access to energy is important for meeting our sustainable development goals. So this is why this particular effort is really critical. And the other thing is that we've got to take in a lot of different factors. And there's some references here that we can have a look at. So I pulled out some key things here just to explain what it is that OnSSET does. So if you want to get electricity to a household or to a village that does, or a town that does not have electricity just yet, there are different ways of doing it. If you're close to the electricity grid, it's the case that you can make a connection to the grid, and that can often be the cheapest thing to do, especially if you're going to be using a large quantity of energy. But as you get further away from the grid, it's the case that you can have small mini grid systems that can be the most economic option, and those can be very useful for providing electricity to a number of households and for some productive uses, so perhaps water pumping and so on. And then when households are far from the grid and quite scattered, so they're not close together, it can be that standalone systems are the optimal systems. And what OnSSET does is it helps make sense of all of these. It looks at every single part of the country and understands the cost for getting either a grid line there or a mini grid system in place or a standalone system. And it figures out what would be the most cost-effective way of doing this for any part of the country. So there are various benefits and drawbacks for the different electrification options that you have. So this is a picture on the left-hand side of the national grid. And the national grid can be extremely useful because it's very high dense power. And if it's the case that you're taking a large amount of electricity to a suburb where there are a large number of consumers, this just makes economic sense. Okay, that's really good. And there are benefits associated with that. You can sort of secure reliable supplies of electricity by operating the grid really well. There are several countries that until very recently thought that all of their electrification they would do via the grid. And this is because as you start to aggregate lots of demand up, you can have big power plants in the system, and this is relatively easy to manage. But there are very big drawbacks, and that is that as soon as you start to go into areas like shown in the bottom left of the screen, as soon as you start to go into areas that are further away from the grid that demand lower quantities of electricity, it becomes expensive. Now, if you're not going to be connected to the grid, there are several different technologies that you can consider using. And it's the case that in OnSSET, we can put in the costs and prices of all of these, and it will tell you what will be the cheapest mix. And this can be really important. And so there are the big reason why so-called distributed generation or generation away from the grid can be important is simply because you can often use local resources. You don't need the big grid infrastructure to get there. So solar panels, for example, if you've got sunshine, it's the case that you can generate electricity. Similarly with small hydro and with wind turbines. Or what's often used are diesel generators, simply because they're relatively easy to repair. There are supply chains in place, and it's the case that you can get diesel or petrol, if it's a petrol generator, relatively easily. So these are alternative options that are there. And the benefits is that they're deployed relatively easily once the supply chains are in place. A problem with these is that the upfront capital costs are typically quite high. So while we can use this model and we can figure out what the least cost way overall of getting things to people are, it's a case that we need to think quite carefully about the financing options. Okay, I think I'll just mention a couple of things here. This is less about the tool and just more about something that's potentially of interest. And that is, it's the case that with OnSSET, we developed this plan of the optimal configuration of the system. But it's also the case that not only do you need to think carefully about things like financing and so on, but also think carefully about how you do the rollout of technology and how you scale up and so on. And we just have some information on some of these, on some of the ways this has been done around the world. And we've seen this, for example, in the United States, when it was being electrified earlier on, the same in the UK, the same in other places. This is an example of Malawi, where they're using OnSSET to do their electrification planning, and they can just leapfrog a whole bunch of the stuff that's been done at different times. So I'm going to stop there for 5 minutes. But before we have our break, I'd like very much if there are any questions that we could ask those, and then I'll talk just a little bit, I think, about the pieces of software and in the tool. So let me just see if are there any questions for the moment? Okay. Okay, so maybe we'll go on and just finish this this quick piece. There was a question in the chat, which was, is the software open access? And yes, it's the case that the software is all open access. What I showed you at the beginning was something called the Explorer, so that website and so on, and I'll send the link to the website in just a second, so that you're more than welcome to play around and look with that. Then underneath that, there's something called the GEP generator, and this is programmed in something called the open source spatial electrification tool. And in this, you can tailor all of your analysis to meet exactly what your needs are. It's the case that every country has different circumstance. You may be in a place where you can procure very large quantities of low-cost solar panels from China, for example, or you have something happening with another bilateral partner, and it changes the prices of things. And so in the generator, you can put in different prices, and then get a new outlook for the country. So whatever's in your interest, you can put in here to use. And then underneath the generator is something called the toolbox. And so what we did was we made every part of all of the software open, and you can go in and you can grab pieces of it too. And so we've seen, for example, the World Resources Institute are using things that come from the GEP toolbox to develop a similar tool, and so on. So everything's there, everything's open, and you're more than welcome to have access to it. It's the case that for this tool, as well as all of the others, we and this will be done with honor at the IEA, as well as other partners and so on. You know, there's annual training events that will take place, and this will all become, what you're seeing now will also all become part of an online teaching course as well. So you can not just look at this introductory presentation or parts of these introductory presentations, but you can have analysts train and work on how to get under the hood and apply this model and the other models as well. I'm just trying to have a look. Could you please share the link for us? I hope there are online trainings. So yes, as I said, there'll be online trainings available at the beginning of next month, and you have free access to those. And then with Honor and his team, it's the case that it's possible to develop really specialized online training as well. So what you could do is then have a look at how to support very specific applications in Ethiopia. Okay, I'll move on then. So thank you for those questions very much. And we'll move on to our next presentation quickly.
And as Mark just mentioned, and as you know, this online course is the first step of our collaboration between IEA and the government of Ethiopia, but we will be very happy to continue with you through in-country trainings we will conduct as soon as it is possible to travel, and also, of course, creating synergies with trainings conducted by other players like Mark and universities and institutions he mentioned, so that we materialize and reinforce capacities with all the possible tool available and platform for training. Sorry, over back to you, Mark.
No, brilliant. And just to emphasize that, you know, our idea very much is to kind of come behind and support. So, you know, this is very much, you know, there's the collaboration with the IEA, and what we can do to support that, and so on is what we're hoping to do. And so with the teaching material and other things, it's the case that hopefully it makes it just a little easier to continue. All right, I just see can you see my screen at the moment, or did the screen share go off when I froze? I think it's
no, it went off. You need to share again.
Okay, so all right, so you've been through some of this before, and as I said, Energy Balance Studio is a relatively it's a very simple tool that is used to help put together energy balances. My computer has frozen. Here we go. And so I just want to go through some of the reasons why energy balances are important. So the first is that energy is this strange commodity, right? It can't be created or destroyed. It just gets used. And so if you want to use some energy in a air conditioner in your office, or in your computer, or in a mobile phone, or for cooking, or for whatever the case is, that energy has got to be supplied. It's got to be transported in some way. It's probably going to be converted in some way. And then there's maybe something else that provides that too. So there's this system, and it gets pulled by what it is that is demanded. And so it creates these, if we were to run the numbers in a particular way, we get what are called energy balances. And those energy balances are just really important for us to understand then how we can manipulate and organize the energy system. On the right-hand side is an example of an energy balance, and the International Energy Agency is absolutely famous for being the organization that has spearheaded the use of these and collected the most energy balances from a number of different places. And these are critically important, very valuable, because they help us think about how to manage our energy system. This is an example of an energy system portrayed with what's called a Sankey diagram. It's got the flows of energy from one part to another. Actually, it's not really a Sankey diagram because we don't have the losses in there. But the bottom line is that the system's interconnected. And so these balances are important. If you change something on the demand there, other bits of the balance change. And so to understand where we are now can be critical, because sometimes we can demand or use more energy than we're able to produce. And as the system goes out of balance, either we can't supply enough, and then that damages the economy or people's livelihoods and so on, or it's the case that we might have oversupply, and then we've got to do something with that oversupply of energy, and we have to have an energy balance allows us to think about how to manage that. It's also really useful just for doing some basic things. So it allows you to compare how you're doing with other countries, which is useful. But it also helps us to do things like get basic performance indicators written up. It helps us to look at things like greenhouse gas emissions and so on. And it's also the start of where this is where we start if we're going to begin doing some energy modeling. And that's the basic idea of this presentation, because with an energy balance, you get this picture, which you can use in these models that are really important. But with this picture, you can think about the targets and other things that you may want to go to into the future. It's also the case that balances can be really important, not just to understand where you are now, but to track how things have changed historically, and also then into the future, if you put policies in place, to understand if those policies are making the overall impacts that we think are important. And these can be important for communicating with various different organizations. So in government, it's the case that you need to be able to communicate across ministries. And this is a way of having your energy data structured in an easy to communicate way across ministries, but also in industry, particularly industry that consumes a lot of energy or produces a lot. Academics and NGOs and international organizations all make reference to energy balances in one way or another. So it's often the case that with trade agreements and other things being set up, that you're interested in this energy balance, or you're interested in things that can be derived from it, like greenhouse gas inventories and so on. And typically, and this is where we're at with Energy Balance Studio. The thing I'm most interested in, though, is after Energy Balance Studio. So we'll go over this quickly, but just as a recap, it's collecting the data, processing it in a way that's appropriate, and then you've got it in this form that you can use for analysis. If you use the same kind of units, that means that you can compare things really quickly. The data collection, this can be problematic, and part of the reason for having the software is just that you get data from different places with different units from different information sources, and you have to be able to reconcile that sensibly. And to do that, there are things that need to be done, from unit conversion to various other things. This Energy Balance Studio maps really easily with a UNSD questionnaire that can be administered. So that's handy. There are various UN publications and so on that they can either feed to, or you can grab from, depending on where you are in the process. yeah, one of the things that's good about EBS is simply that, it allows you to create some intelligence relatively quickly because it's a simple tool, but it's no substitute for, a proper energy balance connecting activity. It is an extremely good start, and it's extremely good and useful for understanding the system, but it's only a start, and there are better systems out there. I want to just very quickly share a screenshot of the software itself, because that can just be useful. So hopefully you can see my screen right now. This is a screenshot of Energy Balance Studio, and basically it's just a kind of spreadsheet thing where you can stick in raw data and then come up with a simplified energy balance later. And as I say, if you've got a proper energy balance statistics activity going on, this is not a substitute for that at all. But if you wanted to train people, get them up to speed quickly, do some activities on the side, it's an extremely useful little tool. Okay, so I'm going to stop on Energy Balance Studio there, and we'll make a quick start on the next bit, which is on a tool called MAED. And there are two parts to MAED. There's one that's about calculating energy demands, and another one that's about calculating electricity load profiles. And so those are both quite important. Just before I go on, though, are there any questions on Energy Balance Studio? Okay, then let me move on. I don't see any questions for the minute. Okay, so we'll look at MAED, which is the model for the analysis of energy demand. Now, like Energy Balance Studio and the Global Electrification Platform and other things, these were developed by a group of different organizations. MAED was developed by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and they're in the process right now of working this out to be an completely open source tool, which is really useful, because then it means that it's the case that it's very easy for everybody to use. So right now it's freely available. You can get it. It's open access. There are no issues with that. But making it open source means that others can join in and develop new formulations and do really new things if that's useful. And one thing that we have found to be really, really successful, and I want to, at the end of the presentation, I'll come back to it in a minute, is that because all of this material is open and the teaching is open and so on, and organizations like the International Energy Agency can provide really valuable support at a government level with the kind of quality assurance and so on that's needed. It's the case that all of this material can also go and be shipped into universities and so on. And we found that, in fact, we're collaborating with some universities in Ethiopia right now. And what we find useful is just that, this can be incorporated into courses, and then you can get some of the new youngsters that are coming out of those are very easy to employ because they're familiar with these tools and so on. And so it can be helpful. It can also be helpful because universities, you can have your own universities do studies on these kinds of things if you want to use that space. And it's a very nice complement to, really strong internationally led activities like this one with the IEA. So let's just quickly go into
Mark, maybe before you proceed, one question on the Energy
okay,
Balance Studio, asking, does it do optimization problem, and can it be used to generate scenarios?
Okay, that's good. So two question. So Energy Balance Studio, no, it does no optimization. All it does is it helps to put information together in one place. So either information you have now or information that, or historical information, and you can put it together, and all it does is it helps you to look at it in a consistent way. It does not do any optimization. It does not help you think about the future, but you need that if you do want to do optimization, or if you do want to think about the future. And so the next 3 tools that we look at are all about that. So so we'll go into that now. How accurate is the planning with this tool is another question. If you don't mind, I would like to come back to that question a bit later, because we're going to go through a number of tools, and there are some important things that we need to unpack in that question, because it's a really important question. But with Energy Balance Studio, what happens is that the results you get are as good as the data that goes in, and it's that simple. But for the other tools, because we're going to be looking into the future, and the future is unknown, we need to think about that a bit carefully, okay, and have a look at what other countries around the world have been doing in order to get the most out of these planning tools. So maybe before I jump into MAED right away, there's a very famous guy who said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. Okay, and we'll talk about what useful means in a minute. So I'm going to come back to that question soon. So let's move on here for another 5 minutes, and then we'll take another quick break. So MAED is, as I say, developed by the International Atomic Energy Agency. In fact, originally it was developed by a French utility. It had a different name, and it was used originally by the French for looking at their long-term demand for energy. It's turned into this piece of software, which is used around the world. There's a large community, and for the first time, there's going to be this openly available teaching material that comes with it, and so on. MAED is something that we use for long-term analysis, and it's to try and get a handle on how much energy we're going to need to meet our social or economic development goals. Okay, so it's difficult to understand the future, but we know that if we want to have industry in the country, and if we want to have people having access to a set of services, if we're going to have those things, we know we're going to need a certain amount of energy to supply them. So that's accurate. That will never change. That's the second law of thermodynamics. That's now what we don't know is exactly how much of these things we're going to have, how much economic activity, how society is going to change, and so on. So there's some uncertainty there. Nobody saw COVID, for example, coming along, which has changed the way we do certain things. But MAED helps us to think about our aspirations, and if we want to get there, how much energy we're going to need to get there. And by the way, if you don't supply that energy, it's impossible to get there. Okay, so it's a really critical tool. There's a generic equation in MAED, which is basically that you have something that you want to get to that requires a certain amount of energy, and depending on how that something where you want to get to changes, you will then multiply that by a per unit amount of energy, and that will tell you overall how much energy you need. So for example, let's say the number of electric motorbikes are increasing in Ethiopia right now. Electric motorbikes are becoming cheaper than gasoline motorbikes. So that means that more people can afford them that couldn't afford them before. And it means that people who are using motorbikes for deliveries or for taxi services or whatever the case, if they move to electric, it's going to be cheaper for them. So electric motorbikes are becoming something that is potentially important. And so as an example, you might say, okay, we think that in 10 years' time, it's the case that we might have 1 million electric motorbikes on the road. If each electric motorbike travels on average this distance and you have to charge its battery so many times in a year, we know how much electricity that electric motorbike needs. So we could take the 1 million multiplied by however many kilowatt hours per year it uses. And all of a sudden, we know how much electricity we're going to need to generate to be able to live with that 1 million electric motorbikes. But maybe electric motorbikes is relatively small. At the same time, you might be thinking, I know that I am going to start increasing some of our mining activities. And for every ton of this kind of ore that I get out of the ground and process, I know I need so many megawatt hours of electricity. Yep. So what we could do then is go to the ministry that's looking after mining, and we can say, look, what are your plans for future mines? What do we think is required, or what do we think is going to be built? And they can tell you. They're typically estimates and projections of this. And then we can go back and we can say, okay, it's estimated that there are going to be 4 or 5 new mines put in place. They're going to be of this size. So they're going to be extracting and processing so many tons of this kind of ore. We know how much electricity is needed to do that. That data is available. And so we take tons, multiply it by that amount of electricity, project it, so we know what the level is that we want economic activity to be at. And then we discover exactly how much electricity is required. So now we can get a projection for the demand for electricity for electric motorbikes, plus the demand for electricity for mining. Maybe we're going to be doing more agriculture and we need to do water pumping. And so we can do the same across all of the various sectors of the economy. And so that static energy balance we saw with Energy Balance Studio, we can then transfer it into something that gives us an idea of what the demands might be into the future. And MAED was put together because it's really quite simple. Okay, it's a very simple way of doing these calculations. So you can have a look at not just what sort of energy is demanded, but if you know the efficiencies of processes, we can then work out backwards. Oh gosh, if I'm going to be using electricity, but that electricity is going to come from coal, and the efficiency of coal is whatever the efficiency of generating electricity from coal is, I can calculate how much coal I require. Okay, and this is what's typically called an accounting model. Sometimes people call it a simulation model, but it's just an accounting model. And it's very, very simple and very straightforward. And it allows us to communicate with other sectors, because energy is not something that people just generate because they want to generate energy. They generate energy and they use for it to be used in different sectors. And so those other sectors are typically associated with other ministries. And understanding their projections into the future helps us to then come back and calculate what energy is required for those different ministries to realize their goals. Because if we're not supplying that energy or can't supply that energy, those goals are not going to be met, simply because energy is so important. Now, in different sectors, we use different units. I was talking about number of motorbikes or the tons of ore that's mined and processed. There are various different things that you can use. We could do something very simple as well. We can say, we know how much energy we need for every unit of economic growth. So if we want the economy to grow at 5% per year or 10% per year, we can calculate how much energy is needed for that to happen. And we could just take the economic growth, multiply it by the energy intensity, and get an estimate. And that's very crude. We can break it down into much more detail. And so there are various different kind of specific energy consumption factors that we put in for different sectors. So here's electricity per dwelling, Here's per unit of agriculture. Here's the amount of fuel used per 100 kilometers. So maybe you want to think about not number of motorbikes, but number of passenger kilometers that are traveled. And the reason why this is broken up is not just because we want to get this estimate over time, but because we can also think about things like how efficiencies may change over time as well. So a car now is typically much more efficient than a car was 20 years ago. And so we can map out the different sectors in our economy. We can figure out how much energy is used per unit of output. And we can add all of these together and develop these driving parameters and do this through different parts of the economy. And there can be different things that we look at in different amounts of detail as well, depending on the data that we've got. And you know, they can vary. And as I say, you can have this in more or less detail as a function of the data that you've got. And that's just an important message too, because the tool is simple enough that you can get started with a very limited amount of data, but you can also develop a strategy so that when you get better data, you can improve the accuracy of the modeling that you're doing. Yeah, these are various bits of information about how to perhaps improve the detail and so on. And there are strategies that you can go into that by going from, you know, either the economy, GDP, going into subsectors. So here we've got industry, services, households, and so on. And so those are the very basic sectors. And then you can go deeper into subsectors as well. And so, but then you can go further still. And so I skipped over the slides in the interest of time, but you can go, for example, then into a sector, into a lot of detail. So manufacturing, there might be a bunch of different manufacturing activities you have going on. And then if you wanted to and you get more data, you can go into some very specific parts of manufacturing and then go into more detail still and understand how all of these things across the economy will change. Now, there's a lot of value to go into more detail, and two immediate reasons are just that the more detail you go into, the more accurate your projections can become. And then the other thing that's important is that the more you understand how energy is used inside of the different subsectors. So in this particular example, where they've gone into industry, manufacturing, equipment, and they've broken that down, I can also think about what energy efficiency could actually do. So if we know that this percentage of electricity used in equipment manufacturing goes to lighting, then we know that if we have a lighting campaign and we replace existing light bulbs with LED light bulbs, we know exactly how much energy will be, energy demand will be reduced. And you can do this through all of the different sectors of the economy. So the United States government, for example, did an analysis like this a few decades ago, and it realized that the efficiency of its motor vehicle fleet was so bad that it was causing the country to lose a huge amount of revenue to purchasing oil into the country. And so it put in fuel efficiency standards, and that completely changed the dynamics of oil consumption in America. And that in turn improved the economic performance of the country because it wasn't having to import as much as it otherwise would. So typically we'd look at a base year, develop some scenarios, you know, where do we want to be by a particular time, and then develop fuel projections. And those fuel projections can be particularly important for our optimization models. So just to say, when we're developing the scenarios, there are things we need to think about. So there's very basic data, GDP and population, okay? But then we can go into more detail, and the more detail gives you the benefits that I was talking about. So then you could go into GDP by sectors. It could go into population by family size, urban, rural, and then various aspects of those population groups as well, and break that down even further, so you can have very targeted policies. And we'll talk about this a bit more later on, but you can develop very simple projections. In MAED, you don't do optimization, but you can go in and you can change things a little bit so that you can think about how, if you were to continue providing electricity or energy like you're doing now, what would that mean for your energy balance? What would it look like? So it's this is an accounting model. You make all of the decisions and it creates a consistent picture for you. This is just a picture of a scenario looking into the future, and you can have different scenarios: low, medium, high, and so on. And of course, nobody knows what the future is, but unless you plan for the future you want, you're not going to get it. And that's a critical point about this type of modeling. Okay, I'd like to stop there for 5 minutes, and then we'll go on to the next model. This is one presentation from a set of about 10, 15, which will take you through all of the details of the models and so on. And again, if this is something that you choose to follow up with Arno and so on, it's there, and be very happy to go into more detail. Before we have our break, maybe I can just have a look at the questions. Okay, right. So what are the abbreviations in the equations? Okay, so those are these were driving equations, and there are a whole number of these things. So we have a glossary. So the easiest answer is going to be, I'll shoot the glossary your way, and then you can have a look. But typically, these are to do with the amount of GDP in a particular sector or some sort of sectoral development. I don't remember exactly where those came from in the presentation, but we have those clearly defined, and so you can jump in and have a look there. But they're from the standard equation, where we look at the amount of energy consumed per unit of GDP or per unit of something else. Oh no, you wanted to answer that question. Oh, okay, very good. All right, may I suggest we have a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back.
Perfect. Let's do that.
Okay, very good. Should we go again? Then we'll start. Let me just share my screen again. So what we'll do very quickly is first thing I thought I'd do is I would share a picture with you of the, I'm back on the global electrification platform, is share a, oh, that's my overly busy diary. So annoying. I tried to share my screen, but there's this thing from Zoom that keeps going down when I want to click on a tab up at the top. There we go. So just so you can see, this is a picture of the MAED software and so on, and it's set up so that it's really quite flexible, and you can do a lot of hands-on things, go into as much detail as you want to go into or not. There are discussion fora online as well, so if you wanted to try and set this up by yourself, there are other people that you could go and talk to who have done this sort of analysis before. So there's a relatively large community, which can be helpful. The next thing I would like to spend just a few seconds going over MAED EL. So just let me stop sharing for a second. I'm not as used to Zoom as I should be. I've been spending too much time on Microsoft Teams. Okay, so what I would like to do now is just let you see, just have a very quick browse through something called MAED EL, which is also important. So for folk, and we'll just spend a couple of minutes on this because we have limited time. So for folk who are not familiar with this space, it's the case that we can, for sure, we can calculate the amount of energy or electricity we need to meet the goals that we want to get to. Sure, we can do that. But it's the case that depending on the sector that's going to get this electricity, the time of the day in which you will demand electricity will change. Now, this is really important for electricity planning, because in electricity, you've got to worry not just about how much energy overall you must supply, but you also have to size your system so that at the time when everybody needs it, you can supply it as well. So in the UK, for example, Christmas is a really big, important holiday. And what happens is that on Christmas Eve, lots of people have got lights on and there are festivities and other things, and or on Christmas Day. And so it's the case that at that particular point, there's a big demand for electricity. And so the UK fires up power plants and other things that it wouldn't normally put on to make sure that it can supply electricity at that time. And so the electricity supply industry has to worry about how much energy is needed, but also when that electricity is supplied. Okay, and with MAED EL, we do a really simple thing where we try and understand how, so first off, we know electricity has got to be supplied at all times, and we try and understand how to figure out what the shape of that demand curve will be. And this is important because later when you optimize the electricity sector, you'll see that, you know, you have some electricity supply assets that can generate whenever you need electricity. They're so-called dispatchable, but some which are not dispatchable. And so understanding both how the demand is going to change plus how some of the supply is going to change is very important in these new electricity systems that are becoming important. This is a screenshot of the software. This is the kind of information that you get out later on, and this is just important for electricity planners. And depending on how you optimize the electricity system, there are different ways in which you can do this. And it's the same as MAED-D, looking at demand, and you can go into various sectors in a fair amount of detail. And so what you want to do is look at how things change over time, how things change in seasons, how things might change during weeks, how they change by hour. So we all have different habits that use different quantities of electricity, and they change on average by hour every day. We have a more or less standard pattern. And if we do this for all of these sectors, what we can come up with is these hourly load curves. And so this piece of software is set up to be able to do that. And there are various equations that you can jump into, but I don't think it would be useful to do that now. Just to say the presentation's available, and in a couple of weeks' time, the full presentation on all of the software would be available for download, and you can work on that if you would like to. Otherwise, it's the case that there is potentially support through activities like this and others. So now what I would like to do is I want to move on to the parts of energy planning that I'm most passionate about, and we'll spend a few minutes going through this. So the first, just to say, in my previous life, I used to have a job much like Arno's, and you know, it would be the case that you'd be very concerned about making sure you can provide super support to the countries that you're partnering with and so on, and they would have needs, and you'd work intensively together and do some really important work. But then one of the issues was always how to keep activities going into the future. And so I moved to academia to start to put together tools and teaching material like this, so that it's the case that international organizations and partner organizations can draw from this this material, but then it lives and it stays, and it's available for for the future. Because at the time when I was doing this, many of these tools were not open access. And so a lot of my time has been spent developing open access tools. We'll talk a little bit now about Osmosis and FlexTool. Osmosis is the open source energy modeling system, and I wrote that together with a set of friends in different organizations. And what this does is it helps us look at how to optimize the entire system. And you could optimize electricity, or you could optimize all energy. And all energy is becoming more important for optimization right now, especially with the electrification of transport. This is a picture of something called a reference energy system. This one I think is just for electricity, but it's a kind of network diagram of the entire system. And so you can understand the role that different power plants are playing, where different demands are happening. And unlike Energy Balance Studio or MAED, this tool now has the flexibility where you can put in a demand into the future. And it has the flexibility to optimize the system, move things around to figure out the lowest cost or the least or the most strategic configuration of the energy system to meet your demands or to meet exports and so on. You know, all models are really simplifications of reality. So one thing to bear in mind is that we use these models to allow us to think through different futures. They give us insights, and those are the most important things. If we go into this in more detail at some time, it's important to know, while we can be very careful about constructing things properly to make sure that representation is accurate, the most important thing we get from these models are the insights that we can then use to frame policy and so on. We cannot predict the future with certainty. So coming back to the question that I answered in the chat earlier on, if we know we want a future with development and other things, we know we're going to need electricity. We know we're going to need other energy forms. So we can calculate how much energy and electricity we need to get to that future. We can also figure out with this tool the best way of optimizing it so we can do it at the lowest possible cost as well, which is great, because then the money that you save can go into other parts of the economy and to make people's lives better. So we can calculate what we need and the best way to get there. Will we get there or not? Well, we don't know, because we don't know what the future is going to be. But if we don't do the planning and we don't get things set up properly, we are guaranteed that we will never get there. Somebody said, you're never going to score a goal if you don't take a shot. And what these tools do is they help us take our best shot at that goal. So we absolutely have to make decisions. If we don't make decisions, we will get nowhere, or we will have an incredibly dysfunctional future. And energy requires government structure, government decision-making. We don't know the future, so we have to make the best decisions we can with the information we have. And these tools help us to do exactly that. So it's quite an important, it's very important to take that away from modeling as a whole. If somebody tells you they can tell you the future, they're lying. They can't. It's impossible. Okay, but if we say that this is probably the best thing we can do given what we know, that is much closer to the truth. So there are different types of energy models that do different things. We're interested in this particular case in models that look 10, 20, 50 years into the future, so we can start to get our system directed in the right direction so that we can support the future that we want. It's the case that there are various things that we might do when we're doing our modeling, worrying about sets of different policies across different government organizations, also thinking about international aspects. For example, how much electricity are we going to be able to export from the Grand Renaissance Dam? How much money can be made from that versus what the requirements will be for industry locally versus other things, and so on. So the very first part of this and the underlying bit of this sort of optimization modeling is to understand all of the bits of the energy supply chain. Now, we started this off looking at Energy Balance Studio, which is important because it helps us to think about things in this structured way. And then in MAED, we started to think about, okay, how could the demands change into the future? But with these systems models, we think not just about the demands changing, but how you can meet those demands, and also how you would supply that electricity to meet, or supply the energies to meet the final demands, and so on. And we think about the imports and exports too. And this creates very important linkages across the economy. On the one hand, with the imports and exports, you have impacts on the macroeconomy and what that does for your balance of payments. And if you have cheap energy, what that does for the rate at which, or the profitability of industries and other things. All of the way through to very specific things. So if you want to expand agriculture, but you don't have electricity for water pumping, what do you do? And so on. So these reference energy systems, what we do in here is we map out the existing energy system, all of the demands we want to meet, and think about what future demands might be there. And different organizations and different governments use different reference energy systems. We have a standard one that you can use and you can start working with, and we've got some standard data to start off with that will be made available at some point, and Honors very kindly help with the IEA is providing some critical information for that. But we typically do something that meets our needs. So there's a lot of flexibility. As I said this already, we start off with the energy balance, and then we map out into the future. Another thing that's important is, so we have this tool, osmosis, as one of a large set of different tools that are very similar. So Markel times, it's more powerful than LEAP, but not as user-friendly as LEAP, which it exists inside of LEAP as well, just as one of the options to use inside of LEAP. Message is another example of a tool that they're very similar to. So this whole family of tools is all really similar. And what we would tend to do is we would use these tools in a sort of process, right? And the first thing is that we want to think about where we want to go to into the future. What are our future perspectives? We then plug inside of those an assessment of our natural resources. How much resource do we have? How much hydro, how much wind, how much solar, da 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 da. We also think about all of the technology options that we have, and there might be a set of assumptions that we put in the tool as well. And some of these assumptions, are to be realistic. The model might run and it might say, ooh, actually, hydropower is so inexpensive in Ethiopia, and electric motorbikes and three-wheelers are so cheap that tomorrow you should just invest in more hydropower and more small electric vehicles. But it may be that you don't want that. That might not be what you want to look at. Maybe you don't want the streets to be flooded with a huge amount of new vehicles. Maybe you want to rather spend effort on more subway systems. So you may put in exogenous assumptions in there. And similarly, there might be other things as well, like you can't build hydropower that fast, or you want to consider regional trade. And so we do all of this analysis inside of these models, and then those go back so that we get an estimate of a balance of payments from the energy sector, how much investment is required in the energy sector, what kind of development that can support. And then that all goes back. We can look at things like economic financial requirements, and that has implications. I also have a look at things like environmental burdens and other things, and that will have implications as well. And then those go back into us thinking about the future we want and what we can afford. And we might do another round of analysis. We might loop these around a little bit and then come up with a future structure of a system that is something that we want. Now, osmosis sits somewhere around here, looking into the future. So we're looking at decades into the future. However, it is really important that we look at how the systems operate in the short term and their flexibility and so on. So we've added to osmosis a tool in this course, a tool from the International Renewable Energy Agency called Flex Tool. And like osmosis, it's completely open source, freely available, and so on, so that you can look at both of these things, some of the short-term constraints, as well as our long-term infrastructure requirements. Just a little thing about energy models, typically we have top-down models. Your Ministry of Finance and others will no doubt be running a macroeconomic model to look at how the overall economy is operating. And this particular type of model is a bottom-up model where we look at all of the different technology configurations and so on, and we can aggregate that to talk to the top-down model. Here are some key steps. I don't necessarily want to go into those in too much detail. The osmosis model itself is open source. It's probably the most used model for academic analysis in the world. It's certainly the most used open source energy systems model for national government analysis. And we have a lot of really good examples where countries have set up their data processing all the way through to their energy systems modeling, through to getting loans from international banks, or moving national financing for infrastructure spend, or getting funding from the GCF or other things. So it's got a really good track record in that respect. But what it does is it does a set of basic calculations as it optimizes the energy system, and it's set up in a very structured way. So you understand what the capital costs are, operating costs, make sure that everything balances, that there's a reserve margin as you need it, and so on. And you can add things to this as well. So many people, we'll look at it in a minute, have added other sectors. So you can also look at like land use and agriculture, for example, and other things too. But it's detailed, and it covers basic things around around energy systems modeling. So a couple of interesting examples for some of the lecture notes in the slide, by the way, the speaker notes are incorrect, but just to say that some interesting examples, the government of Cyprus uses this for its national planning and so on, and it likes to use osmosis because it can negotiate with the European Commission and say very transparently, yeah, but if we do this, if we try and meet this target you're putting on us, it causes problems over here, so we could move things around. And that transparency, whether it's communicating with an external organization like the European Commission in the case of Cyprus, or internally across different government ministries, is really important. There are a set of national examples, and I can provide those if you'd like. At a continental level, there are continental osmosis models. There's for Latin America, for Africa, for Europe, and so on. We'll talk about clues in a minute. And also osmosis is used for some global systems modeling as well. And again, this is really useful because it's the case that there are a large number of people using it. So it's very easy to partner, and also useful for getting into universities. I won't go through this too much, but it's the case that we have a user interface that's programmed inside of Excel and Access, so it's very easy to get around. In the past, some of these user interfaces were quite difficult, so there's a new version that's been put together, and again, that's all available. By the end of this month, there'll be a very simple starter kit for Ethiopia made available as well, which uses a lot of IEA data and so on, and that's there. And then the Flex tool, basically we've added this because it's become so important to have a look at what's happening now with increased penetrations of renewables, as well as flexibility in demand changing over time, storage becoming a thing. And so what Flex tool does is it helps you just make sure when you've got a snapshot of your future, it helps you make sure that all of these pieces can fit together properly. In the past, people have made mistakes. In fact, Germany, a couple of decades ago, made incredibly bad mistakes. and this was just because it was leading the pack. I mean, people hadn't gone there, so they didn't know that there would be these issues. But it was the case that you would see large penetrations of renewable energy coming into the system because they were doing their calculations, and it looked like the more renewables you put in, the lower the cost would be in the future and so on. But they hadn't considered the flexibility of the rest of the system. And they had massive problems trying to cope with the intermittency of the renewables, and it created a lot of issues. So now we know how to cope with this much, much, much better, but we need to include it in our planning so we don't inadvertently get into this space where flexibility is a potential issue. Okay, I want to move on very quickly now, just to something else. So let me just pull up. You have this in so you have this in the link that was shared a minute ago, together with academics in Ethiopia. We put together a really simple application of both. Just share the screen properly. Okay, there we go. I can do it now. Of both osmosis and of the global electrification platform, or the thing underneath it called OnSSET, and found this really, really useful. So because it was possible to do it and possible to create outputs that had a lot of really neat insights. But it's also the case that there's some capacity that's being built that can be used. And so I just wanted to show you this particular case. What they did is they had a look at the off-grid planning and the on-grid planning and synchronized them. And I'll just go to some results. You can browse through this paper. You're more than welcome to have a look at it. And what it would do is it would tell you exactly what to invest in, when to invest in it, and so on. So for example, for generating electricity, and then also provide provide maps and outlooks for how best to provide electricity in off-grid areas and so on. So I'm just browsing through this right now, but please do feel free to have a look at it. It is one analysis. So here are some of the maps for different electrification analysis, plus the potential for supply side things and so on. And this is an academic study. It's just an academic study. But the point is that this can be developed and adopted, and really, really useful things done with it relatively quickly. Okay, so again, if I could ask, maybe I'll stop here for a second or two and ask if there are any questions. How do I stop sharing my screen? Have I stopped sharing my screen? No. Oh no.
Yes, you have.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm using the wrong video conferencing software.
There was one question. I'm not sure if you had a chance to insert your last comment on energy system modeling for manufacturing industry specifically.
Okay, so I see one open question right now, which is, would you emergency system modeling for manufacturing industry, for example, the cement industry. So just to answer that now, so yes, in the model, what we do is we have these, we have in place a reserve margin that's there as a matter of course, and we can construct these models differently. So one of the things with these tools is that they do take a little bit of time to get on top of and to learn well. So we have a basic thing you can run for Ethiopia tomorrow if you wanted to. But, you know, a lot of the concerns, a lot of the national specifics are different in Ethiopia compared to other countries. A lot of other countries' national specifics are also different to other countries and so on. So very important that we can put in the things in there that are most important for us to have a look at. And so it is very possible, if you wanted to put in there extra, what you would do for extra security, let's say, if you are concerned about grid supplies being interrupted for some reason or another. And so we can include those in the model. So you could include emergency generation close to the source, or you can include extra emergency generation in the grid, so it stabilizes the grid and so on. So those kinds of things certainly can look at, and you can include. And again, the detail is very much a function of what you want to look at. So Ethiopia has a number of other unique characteristics. It's an important exporter in the region. So you may well want to, for example, not just look at domestic demand for electricity, but also have a look at other demands as well, like the potential for sales to neighboring countries and so on. And so you might construct the Ethiopian model with a little bit more detail in different areas compared to, say, if you were developing a model for Nigeria, which would have different concerns. Are there any other questions? Okay, I think so. Then let's break for another 5 minutes, and in the last half hour we will go through clues and FinPlan, and then we'll wrap up. Again, thank you so much for bearing with. I'm very, very passionate about this stuff, so sometimes I get maybe a bit more excited than I should. And for me, it's very interesting, but it's a lot of information over a very short period of time. And so just apologies for maybe moving through some of this very quickly. All right, so with that, maybe we break for 5 minutes and then back at 2 minutes to the hour.
Perfect, thanks, Mark.
Okay, so maybe I'll move on then now quickly. Half an hour, and we'll be quite quick. We will go through two other tools. One is called FinPlan, and the other is called Clues. So I'm going to share my screen. So here is FinPlan. Now, it's the case that we do all of this modeling and we think about the infrastructure that we need at the end. So we've been doing energy infrastructure. We'll come on to other things in a minute. The energy infrastructure and knowing how much you need to invest in, when you need to invest in it, and how you're going to operate it is critical information. We need this for policy. We need this to understand how much money we're going to mobilize. We need this to understand how our institutions are going to be arranged in order to cope with this future that we're planning. Okay. One thing that is really important is to go beyond just understanding what to invest in, when, where, and how to operate it, but to think about the financial analysis that results, especially for big infrastructure. And there is this really simple tool that has been put together called FinPlan. Also, this was originally put together by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And before that, I forget who originally developed it. I think there was some original developer even before that, much like MAED. It was originally developed by another organization. And now this is part of these open source tools that are being developed further by a bigger group. What this does is it helps us just think about how to do financial analysis. And this can be incredibly important, especially if the Energy Ministry is then talking to the Ministry of Finance. It understands the language that's being used, and further, if government is thinking about how to engage with international organizations for finance, it's a case that, again, the language is just consistent. So you can be consistent all of the way through from your energy balances, from your raw data, all the way through to then going out and applying for or directing finance to big infrastructure, specifically energy projects. And this creates a really nice set of tools in the toolkit for energy planning. I will spend a couple of minutes talking about this and then move on to clues, simply because of time, but also because I think I've said the things that are most important about this. But essentially, it's the case that a lot of energy investments are really capital intensive. Ethiopia is famous and has done a brilliant job at covering the costs of capital intensive infrastructure. And this tool simply helps to think that through really clearly. So future plans, as Ethiopia's development accelerates or extends, will be can be transferred into financial terms relatively easily. One thing that's interesting is that there is more and more international finance becoming available, and using something like FinPlan, you can think about whether or not you want to take advantage of that international finance. And there are various things that this tool helps you think about as well, and that's like how to de-risk your investments. The less risky an energy investment is in the energy sector, the more likely you're going to be able to get really low cost financing for it. So there are examples of de-risked photovoltaic investments in different parts of the world that produce very low cost solar energy. And Ethiopia, again, has done some brilliant work in this space. And then there are places where the risks have not been taken account or incorporated properly, and prices have become much more expensive than they otherwise would be. It's also interesting. I mean, the thing is that you can finance a lot of your development from internal financial flows, and that can be really, really important. It's also the case, though, that you can blend that with other financing streams that are out there. And another thing that this helps talk to is the so-called enabling environment. So we can think about, you know, what are the aspects around the energy system that make investments in it more or less easy, and then we can understand what that will mean for the types of investment we're likely to get. A key part of this, by the way, is doing really good planning. That's something that underpins a very large amount of energy financial flows into the energy sector, and then on top of that, doing the overall financial analysis. And we can go into this model in more detail, which I won't do for the moment, but it gives you various interesting and useful options. So you take your energy balance, you develop your demand projections, you have a look at what to invest in, where and when, then you have a look at a particular piece of infrastructure, so a particular power plant or set of power plants, and you think about, okay, how can you arrange the financing for this? And depending on how the financing is arranged, as I say, you can get much lower cost money for those infrastructure assets than you might otherwise be able to get to. And again, FinPlan, like the other tools, is open and free, and you have access to that as well. Another thing that's just really useful, and I would recommend, is that it is designed not for financial analysts. And so it's a really, really good first step into understanding the interface between the energy sector and finance, especially when it comes to understanding how to, what the burden will be, what the national burden will be in terms of financial commitments for building new infrastructure and so on. And so that's particularly helpful and useful. And it's the case, again, that all of the material, not just this lecture, but the other lectures that go with it will be made available in a couple of weeks' time. And again, we'll do that through Honor. Okay, I want to move on to our last one now, which is going to be on clues. Now, we mentioned a lot about international organizations and how important it is to coordinate and so on. And so clues is an approach that's used by a lot of international organizations to go and look beyond energy and understand how energy intersects with other sectors. And this is very, very important, because it's the case that if you don't have coherence between the policies in the energy sector and other sectors, particularly around land, water, and greenhouse gas mitigation, you can create very, very strong tensions that can create really big problems. At the same time, if you get these together, they can have compounded positive effects. Okay, so you can get a lot more development per unit of money that you put into it, and so that can be important. The clues is, so the UNDESA, United Nations Division for Economic and Social Affairs, has a really impressive program on clues together with UNDP. And there are a number of national clues models that are used by several governments because there are benefits to be had. And at the moment, I understand that UNDESA is engaging with Ethiopia to develop clues models. And I spoke to some of the analysts just to understand where that is at. And again, like with the other tools, but clues will be a little bit later, the teaching material and other things to support everything will be available online. I'd like to come back to a point about this in a minute as well when we start to wrap up. So, development challenges and so on. It's the case that a large proportion of the world's population don't have enough food, or there's food insecurity. Lots of people lack access to electricity, and electricity is just required for a whole bunch of things in the modern economy that give you opportunities. And it's the case that, and you know, if you're cooking indoors with high smoke levels, it's super pleasant. I mean, I think I annoy my neighbors a lot because I like to barbecue all of the time. There's constantly a fire outside of my house, even in the wet English weather. But if the cooking is happening indoors, we know that pollution levels become high, and it creates really bad respiratory problems for a large number of people. And then it's the case that many people don't have access to safe drinking water, and so on. And we need water for crop production. And so there are at least a few sustainable development goals here that are really tied up, and they're tied up quite strongly. So for example, if we're looking at food production, either for crop production, either for food locally or for exports, it's the case that a large amount of our water is used in crop production. It's also the case that water and the use of water consumes a large proportion of our electricity. That's about 7% of global there, you see in that figure. But if you go to India, for example, where we've been doing a little bit of work, it's as much as 30% of the electricity used by India is for water. It's also the case that agriculture uses a fair amount of energy, and agriculture can provide biofuel feedstocks. So there's this land energy interlinkage as well. And of course, going two ways, depending on how we use land and energy, we emit carbon dioxide emissions, but the other way around is if water availability changes as a result of climate change, that affects our energy supplies, and it affects the amount of irrigation and other things we have to do to provide secure quantities of crops. So these are absolutely interlinked. And I think it's brilliant that, in Ethiopia, you have this ministry that looks at electricity and irrigation together because of this, this important linkage. So we need an integrated approach. And the thing is that there are many examples in different parts of the world where if we coordinate just a little bit better, we can have large positive outcomes. Because of time, I won't spend a large amount of time on it, but this example in India I like a lot. there's a small province in India that has a small amount of the country's land, but that land accounts for a very large proportion of the grain that's fed to, that's provided to ensure that poor Indians in particular get enough food. Now, the problem with that is that government subsidizes it, which is that's not a problem. But the problem is, or not a problem necessarily, the problem is the way the subsidy is done. What they've done is they've said to farmers, okay, for you to produce your crops, we know you need water, so we're going to give you free electricity so you can pump as much water as you need. And now the issue is that folk start to pump out much more water than is sensible. So all of a sudden the water table is going down. Now, as I said earlier on, electricity accounts for a large proportion, water pumping and irrigation and so on accounts for a very large proportion of India's electricity demand. So you have folk that are pumping water, consuming a large quantity of electricity. Because they're over pumping it, the water table goes down, which means that you need to pump it even more. So you consume even more electricity. And as the water table goes down, you create problems locally. And there's this compounding issue that has tied, that has kind of created some policy handcuffs, because it's the case that it's difficult to get out of this now. And yet the strained Indian grid, which is strained, gets strained even further because of policies that were not intelligently coordinated across. And so there might have been better ways to do that. So I think this is a very powerful example. And again, we've mentioned this already. So water for agriculture is important. Water is needed for energy supply, either hydro in Ethiopia, which is important, or for cooling. It's the case that water is required throughout the energy system. In fact, in Europe, in times when there have been heat waves and you've not been able to cool down power plants appropriately, there have been massive power cuts across the continent. Similarly, in different places, there have been problems when water supply has been stopped. So water is absolutely required for all kinds of electricity generation. Electricity and so on is absolutely required for the supply of water. And we know that it's the case that we can produce biofuels from our crops and so on. So I've said all these things already, but if you want to get a hold of some statistics, here there are. It's also the case that the energy system can require large quantities of land as well, depending on what types of energy technologies you're deploying. You need a lot of land. So if you're to deploy a large solar farm, you will need land area for that solar farm. If you're doing a hydro, as we know, we've got to be a bit careful about how we do our flooding and so on, because you will take up land. And the issue with land is, sure, there's an environmental concern on the one hand. On the other, there are very real concerns, not that environmental concerns are not real, but there are also very real concerns about the ability to use that land productively. You could be growing crops from that land and other things. And so is it the case that you want to cover it with energy generating technologies, or is it the case that you want to think of clever ways of doing these together? Again, these are all required and they're all interlinked. And so this is a picture of how we develop a clues model, where before you had just seen what was happening in the energy sector. So we had the energy sector and we looked at that in a fair amount of detail. Okay, but now what we will do is we'll have a look at the water availability generally across the country, and we can make this very average, which is often not very helpful, but it's a start, or we can go into details and look at particular areas in the country, particular places where you want to grow more or less crops, what that means for your energy demand and what that means for your land balance and so on. And we can then think about how to optimize aspects of water and aspects of land as well as aspects of energy, so you can get this really coherent picture for government that does two things. One, it lets you know how much food, water, and energy you're going to be able to supply for your development from local production versus external production. But then it also helps you think about what investments you can do with your limited budget. Everybody has a limited budget, so where to spend that to get the biggest bang for your buck. Another thing that is done quite a bit, and we had a paper come out in Nature recently on this, is that we can think carefully about where the risks are to the system. And we see these risks happening quite a bit. So if I could just talk you through something quite simple. So the climate affects the weather, weather affects rainfall. So we come here, we have a look at rainfall going into our water system. And that's great. If there's enough water for surface runoff, then that goes to land for us to do our farming and so on. And that's all great. But let's say the climate dry, or the weather patterns dry a bit. All of a sudden, there's not as much water going into the water system. Okay, so the water that you were using for generating hydroelectricity goes down. So now you generate less hydroelectricity. Also, you may well pull out water from your water system, and you may need to do some irrigation, which means that you're going to demand more electricity from your energy system. So at the very time when you have strains because you've got less water, your demand for energy goes up, but your ability to generate energy goes down. And this can create really quite bad spiral effects. And in Zimbabwe, not too long ago, with some work that we were doing for the World Bank, we discovered that there was a really big problem because they had issues with, they have other challenges as well. They've got political and other things that are being worked through. But their electricity system, based primarily on hydro, was just not able to supply enough electricity with really dry periods, and this resulted in massive problems with people not being able to pump water just for basic water supply and so on. And then agriculture, where it was irrigated, was taking this massive hit because it wasn't getting enough water, but at the same time there wasn't enough energy to make up for it. And there was this compounding problem in the economy that we estimated, if they didn't address quickly and they kept their current energy plan in place, would basically destroy something like a third of all economic activity in the country because of these interactions. But then what we could do is we could say, okay, fine. We know that there are potentially problems with the water system, so we can design your future hydro systems so that instead of just supplying baseload electricity, they could be used be used as buffers, so you can fill them up and then have very cheap solar and some cheap wind providing electricity, and you use the new bits of the hydro system to balance it. So when it's the nighttime and you need electricity, hydro is running, or even it's the nighttime and there's no wind, then the hydro runs. But if the wind and the solar are running, you could turn your hydro off and start to fill up your dam. And because the Southern African power pool operates relatively well, it's the case that if there are surpluses and you've got more electricity than you need, there's the potential to sell those on the market and so on. So these integrated models can be extremely important. I just stole a couple of slides with permission from some analysis that's going on at the moment in looking at running through some Ethiopian numbers. And it's the case that, we can have a look at export potentials from the country, also have a look at CO2 emissions, where they come from, whether it's land or the energy sector. And immediately you can do all of these in one place, which is powerful. And then have a look at, things like how much area you may need to irrigate and so on. So those are very, very indicative numbers, as well as water use by sector. And I put these just there for illustration, because it's the case that, these kinds of tools can be used and can be used really effectively in policy making, but they can also be used in in research. And I wanted to, let me just stop sharing my screen there. I wanted to just mention a couple of things about that too. But maybe before we get there, are there any questions about those two presentations? So about the model fin plan and about the model clues.
So Mark, I can see one question, but which is related to osmosis.
Mm-hmm. Ah, that's a very nice question. Because I'm an academic and a bit of a geek, when people start using words like deterministic and stochastic and dynamic, it just makes me very happy. So osmosis, in fact, by default, you run it so that you have a set of demands in there, maybe a demand for passenger transport, demand for water pumping, demand for all of these other things that we said are important. And then it will look at those demands into the future, and it will dynamically figure out what it must invest in now to meet future demands and how it should structure the system. And depending on how much detail you have in that, there is more or less dynamism in the way it looks into the future. So by default, that's how we run it. We do have a stochastic version of osmosis as well. And so what you can do in there, and what some analysts have done, and this is very powerful, but you need to be quite competent with osmosis before getting there, is that instead of putting in a data point, because we don't know what the future is, so instead of saying we want GDP to grow by 10%, and that's what we're going to target, because you don't necessarily know that it's going to be that level. What you can do in the stochastic version of osmosis is put in a distribution. So that you might not know the data point, but you think, okay, with some probability, this is what I think I'm going to get to in the future. Or with some probability, this is what I think my hydro load factors are going to look like, because I don't know what the weather's going to hold into the future. Or the same for production from wind turbines or production from solar panels. Although it's the case that for these longer term models, we don't really worry too much about whether or not a cloud is covering a solar panel. We use averages. So from that point of view, yes, you can run osmosis as a fully stochastic model with all of this uncertainty in. But I do want to warn, though, that that is something that you would do after you're really quite comfortable with the standard structure of an osmosis model as well. So it's just very, very doable. And I'm more than happy, I can send a link to a paper in the chat if that's useful, where folk have done this. But it's not let's say it's not a trivial exercise. Are there any other questions? Okay, then again, as I said, there was just one thing I wanted to emphasize again. So, you know, we're incredibly grateful to have this opportunity through the IEA to make these presentations and make these tools available and so on. One thing that we hope we can add in any case is simply that, you know, this material will all be publicly available. There are schools and other things there that, you know, we're hoping will be something we could do with the IEA and potentially other partners and so on. But we're trying to build this up in a way that there's sort of sustainable support that organizations can draw from, either international organizations or yourselves directly. But one of the things with the sort of direct interactions too is that we are really keen, so that for the group that I represent, we're also really keen on seeing how we could help to build some capacity in universities and others as well, just so that inside of the country, if there's demand for this, we certainly don't want to push something for which there's no demand. One of the issues that I used to have when I was doing a job similar to honors is that it is the case that you would always come across excellent patriotic analysts that would do amazing work, but it could become difficult for the knowledge management because people get promoted and move on out of the system. And so just to have access to material that you could use to easily train or bring in new folk, and potentially develop better analysis, because a lot of the analysis that would get done, were we to partner more through the IEA or others on this, is very much around making sure that the tools are co-created and co-owned and fit the national circumstance. There's no way sitting in the UK we could develop a model for Ethiopia that reflects Ethiopian requirements and specifics and so on. But to be able to create the capacity to build these nationally specific tools is something that we could support international organizations as they engage at this important decision-making level. Is also something that we hope to add a little bit of value to. So please do understand what our motivation is and where we're coming from for that. So and to say very grateful for the opportunity to be able to connect in this morning's workshop.
Thanks a lot, Mark. And actually, we're running out of time, so unless there are more questions for you, I'd just like to wrap up. Thanking you very much for your time, for having provided those perspective into the modeling work you and colleagues and partner organizations have been doing. I think it's been a very interesting and insightful overview of different tools, different material available, and I think this is a starting point. So as you all know, these webinars are a first step into the partnership between IEA and the government of Ethiopia, and will come with more training activities, more material, more interactions, and of course coordinating with what Mark and his colleagues have developed, so that we can all make the most of existing tools and practices. So we'll be very, very happy to continue and moving to the next step of more hands-on and looking more into details of the different tools and practices that Mark just presented. And I just like to remind that tomorrow we'll have our last session, and we'll receive Politecnico di Milano, who will focus on 3 topics that will be energy modeling for energy access. The second one will be what they call socioeconomic metabolism with industrial ecology perspective, which relates very much to carbon emissions and environmental input-output analysis. And they will also enter into sustainability assessment discussions. So I think that will be also a passionate conversation tomorrow. So let's meet at the same time, and then we'll have again more opportunity to go deeper with Mark, with Polimi, to work on those topics. So thanks a lot to you, Mark. Thanks to all participants for your attendance, and see you tomorrow morning.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege.
Bye.